there a shadowy, secret cabal of sinister power mongers that practice satanic rituals, traffic children, and pull the levers of our government and media in an attempt to enslave the world? Was Jeffrey Epstein killed to prevent the truth from being exposed? Is Donald Trump the only messiah figure able to take down the deep state and save us from this demonic Illuminati? What if a mysterious internet prophet known as Q is the only one who can reveal the truth? Maybe that sounds pretty wild to you. Maybe you're listening and you go, actually, I totally believe all of that or part of that. Whatever the case may be, I think you're going to be really interested in today's episode. We're talking with Bonnie Christian, a journalist who's been tracking the conspiracy theory movement known as QAnon, and we discuss why many people, including Christians, have become attracted to these sorts of conspiracies. How does the Church of Q, yes, they actually called themselves a church, latch on to ideas in Christian theology and warp them? How are many people who have never heard of QAnon still influenced by ideas emerging from the dark corners of the internet? And how does this movement actually act as a substitute religion for people searching for meaning? I hope you enjoy my conversation with Bonnie Christian, author and journalist who's a contributing editor at The Week. Her work has also been featured in Christianity Today, USA Today, Time Magazine, and a whole bunch of more news outlets. Bonnie is also the author of A Flexible Faith, Rethinking What It Means to Follow Jesus Today. And she actually graduated with the same master's in Christian thought degree from the same seminary as me. So it was really fun to sit down and talk with Bonnie today. I hope you enjoy the conversation. And it was just a few weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, when I was reading a piece that you wrote in The Week about something that I actually wasn't familiar with in its specificity, this QAnon movement. I wasn't familiar with that title, so I was very fascinated by it. But as I began to read, I became really familiar with how I've actually encountered many of these ideas in this movement. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about this piece with you together that you wrote in The Week. In it, you talked about how 76% of Americans have no idea what this QAnon thing is, which is spelled Q, capital A-N-O-N, for those that are maybe wanting to do a Google search, or maybe they shouldn't Google search. I don't know, maybe there's a better way of doing some background digging on it. 76% of Americans have no idea what it is. What is this QAnon, and why should people, especially those who follow Jesus, which make up probably the vast majority of listeners to this program, why should they care?
Sure. So the QAnon is a big thing, and it's a lot of things, and there are definitely variations within the movement. People who come to it for different reasons and believe sort of different versions of it. The really 30,000 feet view, the definition that I gave in that article you've referenced, is essentially this idea that there is a cabal of powerful figures in government, business, academia, and the media. And they are not only, running much of our society for malicious purposes, but they are engaging in really horrific child sex trafficking and also satanic rites of sacrifice. And so there's this figure that they call Q, or the longer title is Q Clearance Patriot. It's an anonymous person, thus the Anon in QAnon, who posts these updates on anonymous web forums. First a site called 4chan, and at this point it's migrated to a couple sites. It's on a site called 8kun. Posts these updates on these sites anonymously, provides a numeric code, password sort of thing to verify that it is the same person each time. And they make essentially predictions often, or revelations about people and things that are happening in politics. And the followers of QAnon, they read these posts, they call them Q drops or breadcrumbs. They read them and they study them very carefully, and they try to find correspondences with it's often very vague. They try to find correspondences with the hints in the headlines of the time. the final piece is that President Trump is their hero, and they very much believe that he is actively working to expose these satanic pedophiles, and that any day now he's going to just announce mass arrests of all these very bad people, who chief among them is Hillary Clinton. They're all going to get arrested. Maybe some of them are going to get executed for their horrible crimes. And so, there's this champion in the White House, and it's going to happen real soon. We don't know exactly when, but he's working behind the scenes to expose all this. And so you'll see in photos of many Trump rallies, you'll see people wearing, like they'll say, have shirts with a big Q on it, and that's indicating their support. And Trump has, on a couple occasions, retweeted people on Twitter who are involved in the movement, or even on at least one case, retweeted a tweet that had QAnon hashtags in it. And so they take this to mean, he's confirming their theories. He's confirming his behind the scenes work that they believe he's doing.
I wasn't familiar with that term QAnon, but as I was reading your piece and then started going, man, I'm familiar with some of these ideas. It reminded me of something that was floating around the internet. Maybe it was a couple years ago, something called Pizzagate. First of all, there's probably listeners to this podcast that know what Pizzagate is. They've heard of it. And then there's like many other, probably most Americans have never even heard of that. What was the link between that term? What is Pizzagate and this sort of idea that there's this secret cabal and an Illuminati group that's practicing human trafficking with children and satanic rituals? What is the connection between those two?
Yeah, so Pizzagate, I think, is most Americans' definite frame of reference for QAnon, if they know about it at all. And there's a story at The Atlantic, which I reference in my piece, and if you have, show notes or something, we should link it there, which it's a big profile of QAnon, and it starts with the Pizzagate story and goes into much more detail about it than I will. But the gist of it is that this was in December of 2016, right after the last election. This guy from North Carolina goes up to Washington, D.C. He has several loaded guns, including an AR-15, and he drives to this little pizzeria called Comet Ping Pong. You could play ping pong while you waited for your pizza. And he storms in expecting that he's going to rescue trafficked children from the basement of the pizzeria. And he believed this because of QAnon. There was one of the theories was that this pizza place was a cover for a child sex trafficking operation, and that that the operation involved key high-ranking figures of the Hillary Clinton campaign. And they got to this by reading leaked emails that came out during the election from her campaign. And it was stuff like, they thought that when they were talking about ordering cheese pizzas, it was about like little girls, and ordering pepperoni pizzas was little boys, or maybe it's the other way around, something like that. And so this man sincerely thought, and by all accounts, he's like a pretty normal guy. Like, he goes to church. I believe he had kids of his own. He was not like, he was normal. He seemed like a reasonable person, and he thought he was going to save children. And so he rolls in with his guns. Everybody panics because he's got an AR-15. And it turns out this building doesn't even have a basement, let alone a basement full of trafficked children. Like, it was just entirely false, entirely made up, and based on this really bizarre, these were normal emails about ordering pizza from a place where they liked to have pizza. There was just nothing to it at all. And so now he's in jail, and, his life and his family's life is ruined by this conspiracy theory.
I'm so certain of this. I'm going to roll into this and act this way in a way that could get me in a lot of trouble. But I think I'm going to rescue some kids. Yeah,
I think the child element of it, is very, once you've bought in, if you think that there's any seriousness to it, the idea that there's these kids in danger, that's incredibly compelling, and will make, many people who are normally peaceful people would do something violent for if they thought children were in real danger. So that's a big piece of it. But I think the bigger thing really has to do with conspiracy theories and their appeal in general. And so, let's take the Epstein case, for example. when people say, oh, in this case, yes, it's plausible that he did not kill himself, right? Like, he's this very powerful man. It looks like he's finally going down. He's finally going to be convicted for things that crimes against children that have been suspected for years. He has these powerful connections. People do get murdered in prison. Is it possible that he was murdered to prevent him from, handing over some of his powerful friends to the cops? Yes, it's possible. On the other hand, to say that it is totally impossible that he killed himself, to requires a view of our justice system that is wildly inaccurate. Jailhouse suicides are a national epidemic. They're far more common than many people realize. If you Google something like prison guard or jail guard laughs, it's even worse if you add death. There's news story on news story of prison guards laughing while people die. And so the idea that it's inconceivable that the guards would be so callous or so incompetent or so heartless and lazy that he would be able to get away with killing himself, especially while facing down a likely life sentence in prison where, prison culture is notorious for permitting violence against people who have hurt children, is that doesn't really strike me as very difficult to believe. So I think the appeal, conspiracy theories are interesting in that in some ways they're very simple and in some ways they're very complex. They're complex in that they draw together bits of information and people and events that appear to be unrelated. And they say, look, I have this explanation that pulls all this in together and explains it. And it's very complicated, and it seems like it's a very, precise, nuanced, researched thing. But they're and so they reject the simpler explanation of like, he killed himself. But they're very simple in another way. They're simple in the prescription for what needs to be done to fix the problem. So if in the case of QAnon, the solution is very simple. It's President Trump arrests all these bad people and stops them from ruining our country. In the case of Jeffrey Epstein, the solution is very simple. It's you don't let all these bad people murder this guy before he can expose them. But in reality, the solution is probably going to be a lot more complex, right? Like if he really did just kill himself, then the solution to preventing things like that is massive and very multifaceted prison reform. It's a lot slower. It's a lot less dramatic. It's a lot less fun. It's going to take, so much more time. It's going to require so much more work. It's not satisfying. And so, they want this magic bullet, and the conspiracy theory offers a magic bullet that's going to make everything right. And reality tends to be much more nuanced. Like the people who are involved are not necessarily evil. Maybe they're just ordinary, greedy, incompetent, lazy people who are serving themselves. And that's a lot messier and more difficult to deal with. And so I think people turn to conspiracy theories often because they're hoping, they're looking and they're seeing real problems in the world. And the actual means of fixing them seems so insurmountable that they want a different answer.
On one level, these claims seem really, really complex. And as you're saying, the solutions might be overly simplistic. How do you actually take the time to evaluate the claims in and of themselves? How could you evaluate? You hear someone bringing up some ideas that are either adjacent to the QAnon movement or they come directly off of the 4chan websites. Mm-hmm. How do you evaluate this?
So I don't have by any means like an encyclopedic knowledge of what the QAnon movement has claimed. I will say, though, that I think something that's really easy and instructive to do is to look at the very first two posts that QAnon made. And this was in late October of 2017. And so the very first post said that the process was already underway to arrest Hillary Clinton, that extradition agreements were in motion so that if she tried to flee the country, other countries would give her back so she could be arrested, that there would be massive riots over her arrest, and that U.S. Marines would conduct the arrest operation, and the National Guard would be mobilized to deal with the riots in major cities. And then a couple hours later, it said that Hillary Clinton had already been detained, even though she wasn't arrested yet. and made a couple other predictions as well. And so it said that all of this would happen on October 30th, 2017. Well, none of it happened. It was all completely false. But then, remarkably, on November 1st, he pops up again and issues a bunch more predictions. Says that like Hillary Clinton advisor John Podesta will be arrested on November 4th. Says that President Trump is going to use the National Emergency Broadcast System to send us all the truth right to our text messages so that he doesn't have to rely on the fake news, which will distort reality. And again, November 4th comes and goes, none of this happens. And so, like from the very get-go, it's nonsense, it's lies, it's predictions that did not come true. And, I think as Christians, there's that verse, and of course I'm forgetting where it is now, but it says to test prophecies and consider whether they actually are proven or not. Now, subsequent QAnon posts, they're not always that specific. They don't always give a date like that where you can point to it and say, look, it did not happen. A lot of times they tend to be, and I think these are a lot of what keeps people in the movement. They tend to be very vague, vague enough that pretty much whatever happens, there'll be a headline you can point to and say, look, it was fulfilled. And those are much more difficult to push back on. If someone is really bought in, and we have a lot of accounts of people buying into the point that they become estranged from their families, marriages are broken up, parents are, refusing to speak to their children. If someone has bought into that degree, then I don't know that any argument is going to help them see that these posts are so vague as to be, able to be fulfilled no matter what happens.
Biblical prophecy is vague enough. And I was wondering, even just hearing you talk, whether or not the appeal to a lot of Christians are Christians that have actually been in those sorts of environments where there is this sort of end times, everyone's talking about speculative eschatology, and it just maps on really well to this sort of, the goalposts move, this is cryptic messages, it's kind of fun to like play with what these messages might mean. Well, it didn't mean that, but we can't give up because there was just a little bit of truth to it, or maybe a reflection of it. I don't know, did you have that experience growing up as well? I don't know if you even grew up in Christian context or if that came to you later in life.
Yeah, no, I did. I was raised in evangelical churches and certainly dispensationalist. I'm sure my mother's read The Late Great Planet Earth. And I certainly remember all of that. We were never in a situation where anyone latched onto a specific date, but certainly the idea of, wars and rumors of wars. And so every military conflict is a sign of the end times. The QR codes are going to be the mark of the beast.
That's right. Credit card.
These days, it seems to be the Bill Gates is going to inject the mark of the beast into you with his vaccines in the form of some sort of tracking chip. There's always a new iteration of it. And I think you're right. And I talked about this just very briefly in the piece I wrote at the week, that there is a real resonance here. The way that QAnon folks sort of study the texts that he posts, that Q posts, and the way that they look for correspondence in the headlines is very, very much like the way some groups of evangelical and fundamentalist Christians who tend to focus on the end times study scripture. And I think that that's part of why this has been such a fit, that we really are finding this among many, in my observation, mostly lapsed evangelicals. Like, I don't think that this is as much among people who are, really involved in their churches and actually, hearing good theology on any regular basis. That's my observation, though it may not be accurate.
People that are actually they would self-identify as in the Church of Q or whatever? Yeah,
I think that again, and this is my perception, but my perception is that the people who are really hardcore into QAnon, who would also call themselves evangelical, probably are not like very active, faithful churchgoers. They probably are more culturally, again, could be wrong, but that's what I've tended to observe. I think there's also resonance there because Q explicitly aligns himself with Christianity. He posts includes Bible verses in his posts with a lot of frequency. The Gospel Coalition recently made a post explaining, what QAnon is and why Christians shouldn't get into it. And if you saw on Twitter, the replies that they got, it was crazy. And a frequent thing that people brought up was QAnon can't be bad because he quotes the Bible. How can you call him satanic when he quotes the Bible? Of course, the Bible itself says Satan quotes scripture. But the people or person behind the conspiracy theory are very clearly marketing to conservative Christians, and there are those pre-existing resonances there that makes that an easy sell compared to at least other groups in our society. And so coming to the QAnon situation, I think people think they're acting in that same way. They think they're doing a good work. They think they're hastening the arrival of justice. They're hastening the defeat of evil. They're supporting Trump in this private, heroic campaign against these evildoers who are aligned with the demonic. And so once you buy in, it all seems to fit very nicely with your Christian duty to protect the innocent, to oppose the devil, to hasten Christ's return. It just all kind of works together once you sort of make that leap into believing absolutely wild, unverified stuff.
And then once you accept it, there seems to be no problem distorting reality to make it fit your lens.
Yeah, it's very
confirmation
flexible.
Bias is one of the strongest psychological phenomenon we experience. We don't want reality around us to be different than what we perceive, because it actually creates a sense in which our existence feels even momentarily threatened. We feel loss of community or identity, and so it's hard to confront once we've actually accepted certain propositions as true. It seems really difficult for people to have any sort of evidence that changes their mind on this stuff.
The QAnon adherents consistently take this attitude of, I'm just researching, I'm just raising questions, I just want to find the truth, whatever that may be. Don't trust me, do your own research. And so people hear that and they think, well, he's not trying to sell me on anything. He just wants me to find out the truth for myself. And that can be very compelling. And then built into the conspiracy theory itself is, of course, this enormous distrust of media and this insistence on satanic involvement. And so that means that anything published in the media that contradicts it can simply be written off as, the media is under the control of these powerful, evil people. And anything at an individual level, if, say, your spouse or your parent or your child comes and contradicts you and says, I don't think this is right, you should not be involved in this, well, Satan made them do it. So at every level, there is a way to explain away objections and to say, evil is making this obstacle. They just don't want me to know the truth that I'm discovering. The biggest one, I think, that people are most likely to encounter is this idea of the deep state. And that's something that, of course, exists in normal, non-conspiratorial or non-conspiracy theory political conversation. And so the deep state is this idea that there's, we have elected officials who change and alternate every 2 to 6 years. But we also, of course, have a permanent bureaucracy of the federal government, people who aren't elected, career bureaucrats, career diplomats, these sorts of people. And so the deep state supposedly is very powerful people in those ranks who are not elected by the American public, and thus in some sense have less accountability to the public. They're very powerful. They're hyper competent. Anytime President Trump wants to do something and then it doesn't happen, they can say, oh, well, the deep state prevented him from doing it. He tried to do it, but they're the people who have to actually, execute his orders, and they gummed up the works and refused to do it right. They sabotaged him. And the deep state, it's difficult to argue against this idea because it's not utterly false, right? Like the permanent bureaucracy does exist. It is often unaccountable. It does often gum things up. But there's a difference, I think, and there are people in it who have politics that differ from the president and politics that differ from, you or I or anyone. And, we would be naive to think that they never let those politics influence how they do their jobs. So all of that is true. That does not mean, however, that there is this organized, competent, nearly unstoppable deep state group in our government that we can blame for anything and everything that happens. A lot of times in politics, the question when we're looking at explanations is this a case of people being stupid or evil? And definitely there are people who are doing things for evil reasons, but most of the time it's people are stupid. Most of the time it's our government is notoriously wasteful and, bad at doing things.
So it's a lack of competency instead of,
yeah,
high degree of
I think
malevolence.
in many cases, we're not dealing with active organized malice. We're dealing with people, we're dealing with problems of waste and of incompetence and of just lack of care that have always existed in our government and are not new. And again, this goes back to what I was saying about the issue of wanting a simpler solution than actually exists, right? Because if there is a deep state and you can just find out who those people are and get them fired or jailed, as is whatever is appropriate, that's a single simple thing we can do to fix our government. But if the problem is that you have millions of federal employees of varying degrees of competence, some of whom should not work there, and you also have them complying with so many laws and regulations, and then the working out of the code from what Congress originally writes, just layers on layers of rules, not all of which are good. It's an enormous problem. How can you even begin to address that and begin to identify what needs to be changed and who should be promoted, who should be let go? It's just insurmountable to even think about as an ordinary person with no direct means of influence on any of that. I would point out a couple of things, though. One, to take the war in Iraq for example, that happened, fully with the participation and at the instigation of elected officials. That wasn't, unelected Defense Department bureaucrats made President Bush go into Iraq. He and his people that he was elected to pick for his cabinets were the one who led that effort. And likewise, when we look at things like CIA coups, like that does not happen without the permission of the president. They're not just operating independently. And so this interest in sort of absolving politicians, public faces that we know and like, and blaming it all on these shadowy anonymous figures, that's very lazy, and it allows us to avoid responsibility for the people that we put in office, the people who are acting with our voted approval in many cases and in our names. So I don't like that shifting of responsibility for the very real and evil things our government has done. But I think most conspiracy theorizing tends to want to overlook the actual complexity of the situation, to shift away responsibility that we may have for what has happened, and to basically avoid doing the hard work of real identified problems that no one can dispute are happening, to focus on imagined problems that, like with the Epstein case, maybe it does turn out that he didn't kill himself, but we can start working on dealing with jailhouse suicides without settling that.
That's a great point. There's plenty of things on the list to do that we can tackle that don't take some sort of special knowledge to be able to address, right?
And I think there's a comparison there. We've been making this comparison to some Christians' focus on eschatology. I think there's a comparison there as well. This is why, as much as, I have an eschatology, obviously, and I think that matters and should influence how I think about God and his plans for the world. I would never want to be fixating on, is this or that event and a sign of the end times? Because what does it really change about what my responsibilities are in daily life? It doesn't change anything. I don't have, different directions from God if the end times are happening. And I think in politics, a lot of that is the same. What we should be doing, what we should be working for, doesn't really change in many cases if there's, some someone behind the scenes making this evil happen versus what we can see just in plain sight.
We've talked on this podcast over the last couple of years about the rise of substitute religions emerging as secularism erodes traditional religious structures. With your background in Christian thought at Bethel, you no doubt explored the work of Charles Taylor and the secular age thesis, and we've covered that quite a bit on this podcast. How does the QAnon movement act as one of these substitute religions in a secular age?
Well, it does it in two senses, I think. One is in the broad sense. It sort of can function to fill a lot of the needs that people traditionally would have filled at church. Things like giving you a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, gives you a community. Many of the people who are profiled in reports on QAnon, they come off as just very lonely. One woman, I remember reading a quote, she would say that she would go on places like Twitter and just browse QAnon hashtags, trying to make friends, basically. She wanted people to talk to. And so I think in that sense, for many people, it fills those needs that previously would have been filled in more traditional religious contexts, be that church or something else. On a smaller scale, and this was what I wrote about a lot in my article, there's this really interesting situation where there actually is a church of QAnon. Like, they explicitly describe themselves that way. They've started holding Sunday services. They actually call
themselves a church?
They do. They started holding Sunday services. They're doing it remotely because this is I think they're not all in the same place. And this is mostly something that's been happening during the pandemic. So they couldn't necessarily gather together in person anyway. But they have prayer, they take communion, and then they study scripture and Q texts together, and they use one to interpret the other. And so it's explicitly becoming a religion at that point. Now, whether, QAnon, most people have not heard of it. Most people who are involved in it are not involved in this little congregation. But they seem intent on spreading. I cited the work of a PhD student who has attended these services for several weeks. And his report is that essentially they're trying to train their congregants to then start house churches of QAnon in their own area. And there are several hundred congregants. So you can see how that could spread quite quickly if they are successful. So yeah, for the vast majority of QAnon people, it's filling religious needs, but not necessarily, it's not making sort of like the transcendent claims that a religion typically will. But there is this shift in at least this one small corner of it where they are explicitly becoming a religious movement.